When the Great Patriotic War began, aviation was a male-dominated field. Soviet women with flying skills understood that their place was in the skies, defending the motherland. One of the key figures who transformed this determination into a true fighting force was Marina Mikhailovna Raskova, a hero of the Soviet Union and renowned pilot-navigator who set several world records even before the war. Using her authority and personal connections, Raskova secured an unprecedented decision from the Supreme Command Headquarters, SHC, the creation of 3 women's aviation regiments. This occurred in October 1941. No other country in the world had all-female combat units in the Air Force. Among these 3 regiments was the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, later renamed the 46th Guards, destined to become the most famous. Recruitment to the regiment was not by quota, but by a rigorous selection process. These were young women, many barely 20 years old. Among them were students from aviation technical schools and flying clubs, as well as experienced instructors. All of them possessed not only excellent piloting skills but also an unwavering will to fight. Training took place in conditions as close to combat as possible, yet at incredible speed. The entire training period was limited to just a few months. They had to master piloting techniques, navigation, bombing, and, most importantly, the art of night flying. They studied during the day and flew training sorties at night. Raskova insisted that all regiment personnel, from mechanics to commanders, be female, a rarity that created a unique atmosphere within the team. The most unusual factor, which shaped the regiment's entire tactics and legend, was their aircraft, the P-2 Polikarpov II. This biplane, 2-winged aircraft, was originally designed for training, agricultural, for spraying fields, and liaison. Its specifications were modest. Construction, wooden frame covered with fabric, percale. Speed, maximum speed rarely exceeded 120 to 150 km per hour. Armament, could carry only 300 to 350 kilograms of bombs, compared to tons carried by heavy bombers. Protection, completely lacking armor. Many aircraft didn't even have machine guns, making them extremely vulnerable. At first glance, this was a mockery of aviation. How could such flying shells possibly fight against the formidable German air defenses and Messerschmitt fighters? But the P-2's very weaknesses became its greatest advantages in night combat. Stealth, the wooden and fabric aircraft had very low radar signature. It was practically invisible to the radars of the time. Low speed ceiling, the P-2 could fly at speeds lower than the minimum flight speed of German fighters, for example, the Me-109. A German ace, attempting to attack a P-2, often missed or stalled due to its poor maneuverability at low speeds. Silence, just before approaching the target, the pilots would shut off the engine. The biplane, gliding downward, produced only a whistling sound as it cut through the air. It was this sound, reminiscent of the rustle of a broom, that gave the women their ominous nickname. In June 1942, the regiment entered combat on the Southern Front. Their mission was pinpoint night bombing of enemy rear area targets, ammunition depots, headquarters, vehicle columns, and airfields. The regiment's tactics were honed to the point of automatism and relied on surprise and precision. Flights in the dark. Flights were carried out exclusively under cover of darkness, often in poor weather or moonlit nights, which facilitated navigation but increased the risk of detection. Extreme low-altitude bombing. This increased accuracy but made the aircraft vulnerable to small arms fire. Carousel. The women worked in groups of 2 or 3 aircraft. While one bomber approached the target and dropped its payload, the others drew fire. Then they quickly took turns, maintaining a continuous bombing strike. The Germans didn't immediately realize who was attacking them. At first, they attributed these precise and unnerving strikes to experienced male pilots. When it became known that their peace was being disturbed by young Soviet female pilots, it provoked a mixture of rage, fear, and superstitious terror. The very term Nachthexen, night witches, stuck with the regiment after intercepted German radio communications. The Germans couldn't understand how these flying logs, which they couldn't detect with radar or shoot down with fighters, could appear out of nowhere, drop their payload, and instantly disappear into the darkness. They decided that Russian women were using some kind of black magic or spell to become invisible. For every P-2 shot down, the German command promised its soldiers an Iron Cross. This was evidence of the serious threat that night witches had become to their logistics and psychological well-being. If the P-2 was an elusive phantom for the enemy, for the pilots it was a machine that constantly tested their mettle. Conditions in the regiment were far from comfortable, even by the standards of frontline aviation. The P-2 cockpits were open, or semi-open, meaning the pilots were completely exposed to the elements. Most missions took place at low and medium altitudes, up to 3,000 meters, where even in summer the weather was piercingly damp and cold. In winter, this became sheer torture. The pilots and navigators shivered despite their warm uniforms and felt boots. Any careless touch to a metal part in the cockpit could lead to frostbite. In their memoirs, they often described returning to the airfield with frozen eyelashes and chunks of ice on their faces. The navigation equipment on the P-2 was primitive: maps, a compass, and a stopwatch. There were no sophisticated autopilots or radio altimeters. The navigators navigated by the stars, trains, river curves, and even the smell of the ground and smoke. A navigator's error during a night flight over enemy territory meant not only mission failure but also, most likely, death. The fuel tanks were located directly in front of the cockpit, and if hit by a bullet, the aircraft would instantly burst into flames. The women flew at the utmost risk, knowing that their chances of surviving a P-2 hit were minimal. Since the P-2 couldn't carry large bombs, inflicting real damage required several sorties per night, sometimes up to 10 or more. The female mechanics worked to the limit, fueling and slinging bombs manually between sorties, often under fire. The pilots and navigators, exhausted by the cold, engine noise, and constant nervous tension, barely had time to eat or sleep. This frantic intensity demanded phenomenal physical and mental endurance. The regiment commander was Evdokia Bershanskaya, an Iron Lady, the only woman to command an entire regiment throughout the war. Under her leadership, a unique night combat tactic was developed and perfected that turned the P-2's shortcomings into deadly advantages. Silence tactics. The regiment's main secret lay in the final stage of the attack. When 2 to 3 kilometers from the target, the pilot would drop altitude and then shut off the engine. The aircraft would enter a silent glide. Effect: in the stillness of the night, this glide was audible as a faint whistle or rustle, undetectable by both listening devices and acoustic radars. The Germans would begin a frantic search for the source of the sound, but by the time they found it, the bombs had already fallen. Bomb drop: bombs were dropped manually, often without the aid of a sight, which was primitive. Navigators relied on precise calculations, which they honed to perfection. After the drop, the pilot would immediately restart the engine and, performing an anti-aircraft maneuver, descend at minimum altitude. Using diversionary targets. Working in groups, the night witches forced the German air defenses to waste ammunition. 2 aircraft, the lead ones, approached the target from different directions. The first aircraft would draw fire by using bright tracer bullets or dropping decoys to simulate explosions. The second, taking advantage of the moment when the anti-aircraft searchlights were occupied by the lead aircraft, would silently approach the target and deliver a precise strike. The Germans often opened heavy barrages based on sound, creating a literal wall of fire, but the P-2's low speed and altitude made it a difficult target for even the most accurate anti-aircraft gunners. The courage shown by the female pilots of the regiment brought the regiment glory and high awards. Each pilot and navigator was a model of fortitude. Evgenia Rudneva, a navigator, was one of the regiment's pioneers. A graduate of Moscow State University and an astronomer, she used her knowledge of the stars to improve navigation in the most challenging conditions. She died in 1944, but her bombing accuracy became legendary. Paulina Gelman, one of the youngest, rose from a rank-and-file navigator to the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. She flew 857 combat sorties, demonstrating incredible endurance and perseverance. Her missions were often the most difficult, passing through the most heavily fortified German areas. Nina Raspopova was a pilot who survived several crashes and landings in enemy territory, but always returned to duty. Her story is an example of sheer willpower. During one sortie, her plane was severely damaged, but she managed to reach friendly forces, saving her navigator and the valuable aircraft. During the heaviest fighting, the regiment flew up to 300 sorties per month. This was a titanic undertaking that not only harassed the Germans but also seriously disrupted their logistics and caused real damage to headquarters and warehouses. During the war, the regiment flew over 23,000 combat sorties, dropping over 3,000 tons of bombs. The nickname, Nachthexen, night witches, stuck with the regiment not only because of their elusiveness, but also because of the profound psychological impact they had on German soldiers and officers. Their attacks weren't just bombing raids, they were psychological warfare. Disruption of sleep and morale. The night witches' attacks were regular, typically beginning shortly after dark and continuing until dawn. They deprived German troops of adequate rest. The constant anticipation of the silent whistle of a diving P-2 strained the soldiers' nerves to the breaking point. Sleep became an impossible luxury. Humiliation and fear. The thought of their positions and headquarters being attacked with impunity by young women in ancient, flying sheds, humiliated the pride of the Wehrmacht, which considered its equipment and air force invincible. Fear of an invisible but accurate enemy demoralized even the most steadfast soldiers. Pinpoint terror. The girls often struck specific, personal, targets, headquarters dugouts, tents of high-ranking officers, and cars. This created the impression that the witches knew everything about them, which only heightened their superstitious fear. German witch hunt. The German command was forced to take extraordinary measures. The best night fighters, including modified Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Junkers Ju 88s, were dispatched to hunt the night witches. Fighter tactics. Since the P-2 was unseen by radar, German pilots, such as Ace Joseph Kosiak, were forced to hunt visually, using moonlight and tracer bullets. However, due to the P-2's incredibly low speed, German fighters had a difficult time keeping them in their sights. The P-2 was simply too slow. Sky Cats. In the regiment, this hunt was called Sky Cats versus Sky Mice. It was an unequal battle, a powerful, armed fighter against a wooden, unarmed, slow-moving machine. Victory over the P-2 was a matter of honor for the Germans, but also an enormous challenge. The regiment's success came at a terrible price. The regiment lost 32 pilots, many of whom perished not from anti-aircraft fire, but from attacks by night fighters that sometimes awaited them along the return route. The losses were particularly heavy because lack of parachutes. To save space and weight, many P-2 pilots did not carry parachutes or did not have time to use them. Rescue during a fire on board the wooden aircraft was virtually impossible. Fire. A tracer bullet or shrapnel striking the fuel tank instantly turned the P-2 into a fiery torch. The girls died without even having time to feel pain. Sacrifice. In their memoirs, surviving pilots describe how their comrades, seeing death as inevitable, tried to the last to divert the burning plane away from populated areas or drop bombs on enemy positions, instead of fleeing. Evdokia Nozel, a hero of the Soviet Union, died in 1943 while on a combat mission. A shell fragment struck her directly in the temple. The navigator, Larissa Rozanova, took control and landed the plane, but the pilot could no longer be saved. Such tragedies were commonplace. The regiment was very close-knit, and each loss was felt as a personal pain, but it did not stop the combat mission. The successes of the 46th Guards Regiment became a powerful propaganda tool. The Soviet Union used their stories to demonstrate the courage of the Soviet people and gender equality in the fight against fascism. International attention. Stories of the night witches were published in the Allied press, including in England and the United States, sparking admiration and surprise. While Western women worked in the rear, Soviet women fought on the front lines. Highest awards. For outstanding service, 23 female pilots of the regiment were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, and Evdokia Brushanskaya herself was awarded the Order of Suvorov, 3rd class, an extremely rare award for women. Their legacy became proof that heroism knows no gender, and that professionalism and the will to win can overcome the enemy's technical superiority. They were a shining example that war is not only a battle of machines, but, above all, a battle of the spirit. The Night Witches Regiment, having fought in the North Caucasus, Kuban, and Crimea, not only survived but also became one of the most effective and decorated units of the Air Force. By 1944, they were already liberating Polish territory and approaching the borders of Germany. Their work remained consistently difficult, but the pilots' skills were honed to perfection. They bombed bridges, railway junctions, and fortified positions with incredible precision, supporting the advance of ground forces. During their missions, they often collaborated with partisans, dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies, which required pinpoint precision piloting at extremely low altitudes. Figures testifying to their feat. By the end of the war, the 46th Guards Regiment became one of the most decorated in the Red Army Air Force. Total combat sorties, over 23,672. Bombs dropped, over 3,000 tons, with each aircraft carrying a maximum of 350 kilograms. Days in combat, 1,105 days, from the first to the last day of their participation in combat. Heroes of the Soviet Union, 23 pilots and navigators. The regiment flew its final combat sorties over Germany, participating in the breakthrough of the German defenses on the Oder. Their final combat mission took place on the night of May 8, 1945. This flight symbolized the completion of a 3-year marathon in the skies, which began with primitive training aircraft and culminated in victory. After Germany's surrender, the regiment, stationed in Poland, was immediately relocated and then, in October 1945, disbanded. This decision was dramatic. The regiment, which had endured the most brutal fighting, was not given the honor of parading on Red Square on Victory Day. The girls surrendered their P-2 combat aircraft, deemed obsolete, and were demobilized. Returning to civilian life was perhaps the most difficult test for many veterans. Contrast of realities, yesterday's squadron commanders, navigators and pilots, whose names were known throughout the front, returned to civilian professions, engineering, teaching, journalism. Psychological barrier, many faced a lack of understanding from society. The war, seen from a bird's eye view, left an indelible mark. They found it difficult to speak of their exploits and losses. For decades, women's combat roles, especially those as unique as the Night Witches, were often overshadowed by official history. Nevertheless, the regiment remained a family. Commander Evdokia Brushanskaya maintained contact with her former comrades until the end of her life. They gathered annually to remember their fallen friends and that incredible era when, as young men, they changed the course of the war in flimsy aircraft. The story of the 46th Guards Regiment is more than just a chapter in aviation history. It is a unique testament to human resilience. These women prove that, when necessary, technical superiority can be overcome using intelligence, cunning, teamwork, and, most importantly, an unbreakable will. Symbol of equality, the regiment remains a shining example of women's contribution to combat in the history of the 20th century. A lesson for the future, their story teaches us that true strength lies not in the thickness of armor, but in the determination of a person willing to sacrifice to defend their land. The legacy of the Night Witches lives on in books, films, and now, thanks to the Lest We Remember channel, in stories for a new generation. We remember them not only for their accurate bombing strikes, but also for their youth, their friendship, and their sacrifice. They were called witches because they defied all the laws of war. They were a beacon of light in the darkest night. And as we tell their stories, their wooden planes continue to glide silently through the skies of our memories. Lest we remember.